Hello and welcome to the Transparency International Brazil Dialogues Getting Ahead of the Curve. I'll make a quick announcement in Portuguese and then switch back to English again. Bom dia a todos e todas que nos acompanham. Eu queria anunciar que esse episódio de lançamento da série À Frente da Curva será excepcionalmente em inglês, mas os vídeos serão posteriormente disponibilizados, legendados em português. Convido vocês a acessarem e compartilharem o nosso conteúdo. Muito obrigado novamente por nos acompanhar. So, back again to English. The TI Brazil Dialogues Getting Ahead of the Curve is a special initiative that will explore post-COVID-19 trends and the impact of these changes on the fight against corruption, governance, and development, based on major themes of our social, economic, and political life. In this first episode, we will discuss civil rights, social participation, and democracy. I am Bruno Brandão, the Executive Director of Transparency International Brazil, and today I have the honor to talk to two global leaders and activists of the anti-corruption and human rights agendas. Delia Rubio, Global Chair of Transparency International, and Sarah Beamish, Global Chair of Amnesty International. Hello, Delia. Hello, Sarah. Sarah Beamish is a lawyer with a Juris Doctor from the University of Toronto. She also holds a Master's in Global Affairs and a Bachelor's in Political Science. As a lawyer, she has practiced across a range of areas with a focus on civil litigation, human rights law, and non-profit charity law, and on serving people and groups that face systemic discrimination, particularly indigenous peoples. She has also undertaken human rights-related work on discrimination and corporate accountability in the extractive sector. Thank you very much for joining us, Sarah. Delia Ferreira is a former president of Transparency International's chapters in Argentina, Poder Ciudadano, and has served as chief advisor for several representatives and senators at the Argentinian National Congress, and has advised the Constitutional Committee of both the House of Representatives and the Senate and the National Accounting Office in Argentina. Currently, she works as an independent consultant and has consulted on anti-corruption related issues with international organizations, NGOs, mainly in Latin America. Delia has a PhD in law from the Madrid's Complutense University and is the author of numerous publications on democratic culture and political institutions, comparative politics, and public and parliamentary ethics. She was elected to Transparency International's board in 2008 and 2011, and then again as chair in 2017. Thank you very much for being with us today, Delia. Muchas gracias. So without further ado, I'd like to start with a question that connects us to our main theme. History accelerates in periods of severe crisis, but to what direction, we don't know. It can aggravate pre-existing structural problems, such as inequalities in so many levels, but it can also take another direction, with the crisis as an opportunity for systemic changes, for correcting paths. So, Sarah, starting with you, what do you see ahead of the curve?
Thank you, Bruno. It's not an easy question. And I think maybe to start, I'll just say a minute or two about some of the assumptions Amnesty has made in our own approach to this issue. Some of our assumptions around what's going to happen over the next year or so as COVID continues to unfold, and that will shape the context in which groups like Transparency and Amnesty have to act. I mean, obviously, we have an assumption that COVID is going to continue to spread around the world with peaks in different regions at in different times over the next year. We certainly assume that it's going to be the poorest and the most marginalized who will continue to suffer the most. We assume that governments will continue to introduce legislation that restricts human rights, particularly rights to freedom of expression, assembly, and movement, and grounding those restrictions in public health concerns. We assume that we will continue to see increased surveillance and increased misuse of technology, again, justified by COVID measures. We assume that we will see increased austerity measures that will lead to social instability and affect a whole range of economic, social, cultural rights. We assume that states and leaders will continue to use the pandemic to demonize marginalized groups, and particularly refugees and migrants, other minorities, LGBTQI people. Probably increasingly restrictive approaches to migration and asylum. Women and girls will continue to experience multifaceted and disproportionate impacts. And we assume that while it's been older people so far who have experienced the brunt of the public health crisis, over the long term, we think that young people will suffer the most from the fallout of COVID. Certainly racial minorities and particularly Indigenous people will be very harshly, disproportionately affected by this. And Indigenous people in particular ways, especially given their intergenerational histories of being very harmed and sometimes decimated by pandemics. Now that's some of the context in which we're operating. Now, if this is one of these moments in history where you really see the reason that we need government. It's such an important test of government. And as you've said, Bruno, times of crisis, they often lead to transformational change. And the question is it for better or for worse? Certainly, COVID has exposed with very brutal clarity the brokenness of our social, economic, and political systems and the brokenness of the values that have underpinned them. And now, as the rules are being rewritten in some ways, in unprecedented ways, and at a pace that we never would have imagined a year ago, this is the time for a really bold vision and big thinking about the future that we want. And as COVID has exposed both the inequalities between us and the injustices between us, but it's also exposed how interconnected we are, and that in some ways, we are only as safe as the most marginalized and the most vulnerable among us. And so this has created a rare moment for us where we all have a direct stake in creating a more equitable world. So moments like this are very dangerous because we know how governments and businesses and other powerful actors will misuse them, but they're also so ripe with possibility. And I certainly can't predict where we will be ahead of the curve, but I think that a very important thing to remember in hopefully getting to a good place beyond this curve is the importance of narratives. And we can't simply wait to react to a narrative that's written by others. Now is a time for groups like ours and the people to tell a different story about the future. And what Amnesty has been, I guess, trying to focus on and how we tell that new narrative about the future is looking at this idea of the curve. So of course, we've talked about flattening the COVID curve. But in doing that, we've seen how the shape of many other curves is harming our resilience, is threatening our recovery, and could ultimately really hurt and destroy us. So we've been looking at three curves that I think and hope are a vital part of what comes beyond the curve. And so the first one is the wealth distribution curve, and which shows us the extent of global inequality. So that's one piece of what we have to tackle. The second is the emissions curve, the carbon emissions curve, which has stood as a warning of how we are destroying our planet and is another critical piece that we need to address. And then a third is the curve of data collection, which is putting so much of our freedom in the hands of a very small and powerful few. So each of these three curves is showing, I guess, speaks to things that we need to address together if we are to get beyond the COVID curve in a just way.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Delia, is this also the path you see ahead of the curve? What is the future you envision?
Well, we coincide very much with what Sarah has said. In fact, the name of this dialogue has to do with the document that our team prepared here in Berlin at the beginning of the crisis, the COVID pandemic. And of course, the crisis is multifaceted, and we see all these global trends that has been accelerated. Last year, we conducted an exercise and a scenario exercise for 2030, and many of these trends were already there: the concentration of power, the abuse of power, the increased surveillance on society, the shrinking space for civil society, the attacks or intents to censor independent press. And of course, this inequality in society and the increased poverty in many regions. What we have seen now since March, when the pandemic took place all over the world, really, and it was not concentrated in China any longer, is that these tendencies has been accelerated. So the pandemic has been used as an excuse by some governments and by some particular or private interests as an opportunity to involve in illegal agreements or going beyond what rule of law guarantees an authority for presidents or prime ministers. So the tendency is already there. What I see beyond the curve or ahead the curve is uncertainty. And my word is we have to be alert, because we don't know exactly how the ones at the wheel will react in front of these opportunities for them and challenges for us, and the way around. I am an optimistic, so I think we have to take in our hands a more active participation, and that's exactly what we have been doing, particularly with Amnesty International this year, starting in January, when we very strongly initiate a movement towards the G20, which was this year held in Saudi Arabia, a country which is characterized not by its respect of human rights. And putting together the agenda of human rights and anti-corruption is a very important thing, because for some years we have been leading like of separated agendas, which is not the right way, because when we fight against corruption, we are fighting for human dignity, for human equality, for access to services, for non-discrimination. So we are fighting for human rights already. But from this year on, we are working together. This idea of collective action, I think, is very important in general, but particularly in this kind of challenging times. So we started working with Amnesty in a very strong document saying we are not going to go to Saudi Arabia. And we managed to get more than 200 international NGOs and national NGOs supporting our statement. And then when the pandemic was already there, we signed a petition to G20 countries in terms of how they should react and what were our concrete asks from them in terms of rights, in terms of treatment, in terms of respect of human rights in the population. So we are already working together, which is an important thing going beyond the curve.
Excellent. Delia, I think you connected with something, with a concrete example of what Sarah said in her first answer. She said something I believe it's very important at this moment, which is the necessity that ourselves, we can write our own narrative and don't live on the narrative written by by others. That same connected to the second question I would like to pose to both of you about the future ahead is not going to be an accident, of course. It's going to be the result of decisions being made right now. By whom, in the name of whom, with what interests involved. So you gave an example of this narrative of Transparency International together with Amnesty International, trying to build our own narrative in the name of civil society towards the G20. Mm-hmm. So we're not going to sit and simply accept the narrative written by the leaders, but we want to be part of this narrative building. What can we inspire also at the national level or locally? How can people be part of this narrative ahead of the curve? Maybe Delia, you already gave an example of the G20. Do you have any ideas to inspire locally this participation?
In fact, you know that our movement has chapters in more than 100 countries in the world. And immediately, once the pandemic was clear as a global challenge for all of us, in many regions, the chapters organized themselves in order to produce recommendations for the governments of the regions in terms of the first concern that we really take very seriously, because emergencies increase the risk of corruption. It has always been so, and it is much more challenging in a global emergency when everybody is facing the same problem at the same moment, needing the same resources and the same things. So all the regions prepare recommendations on public procurement to the governments in the region, pointing out what they can do in order to avoid or prevent corruption happening. And we have to say that the reports on corruption appear simultaneously with the crisis. In other international or humanitarian crises, the reports of corruption or the investigations around corruption vis-a-vis the crisis appear after the crisis. In this situation, something which is particularly important is that the reports and the investigation on cases of corruption are simultaneous. We have received reports in all our ALACs, our centers for legal assistance on corruption. We have seen investigative journalists immediately going into the investigations related to public procurement, to the use of multilateral funds. There are millions of dollars circulating from the IMF, the World Bank, going to countries. Are we adding the accountability tools to that resources in order to guarantee that money goes to those who need the support? And in this sense, we have also at the global level prepared with some other NGOs communications with IMF and the global, the World Bank, in order to ask them to be absolutely sure to incorporate accountability and transparency measures in these subsidies and loans. And now we are tracking what they are doing, whether in each of the loans to each of the countries, the rules are there, the tools are there in order to guarantee accountability. And in the local, the country level, what we have done through our chapters is to follow the crisis and help people reporting corruption, help whistleblowers reporting corruption, monitor public procurement or purchases of masks, tests, hospitals, and taking care of this very multifaceted crisis as better as we can in the local level. So we are doing lots of things.
That's similar to in the environmental area, the groups, the environmental movement is advocating for the Green New Deal, right? And we also need to expand this concept in terms of accountability, in terms of respect for rights. I think there are many agendas that can connect to these new global deals, these economic reforms incorporating these rights. And Sarah, you mentioned 3 curves that's very important, very concrete. You mentioned the wealth curve, you mentioned the carbon emissions curve, and the curve of the data collecting. And how can we, in your own words, how can we be part of this narrative building? How can we instead be participating as society in this, the flattening or the transformation of these 3 curves?
Well, I think on the wealth curve, what Amnesty has been saying is that governments need to set a really bold vision to transform our societies on the basis of economic, racial, and gender equality, and be actively investing to make that happen. And that means delivering climate action that reduces inequalities, measuring the right things. So going beyond just looking at GDP as measures of how well we're doing. Investing in healthcare systems, investing in worker protections, dismantling the historic structural injustices in their societies. So the types of things that the Black Lives Matter movement is calling for now. Those and many other things are part of addressing the wealth curve. Looking at the emissions curve, it's vital that the COVID recovery plans are based on a vision of a zero carbon economy and equal and resilient society. So I know, at least here in my country, we're almost seeing the opposite in some ways, where governments are using this moment and COVID economic recovery as a moment to dismantle environmental legislation, environmental protection legislation, rather than strengthening it. So certainly challenging things like that is a key part of dealing with that curve. And then the data curve, we need proper scrutiny. I mean, big tech is going to be gaining massive power during this time, and we need to keep proper scrutiny on them, make sure people are in control of their own personal data, and making sure people have the right to access a digital world without pervasive surveillance.
One thing that you mentioned, Sarah, is very interesting, which is the use of the COVID pandemic as a cover for taking other measures that should have, if people were not so worried about COVID and the healthcare situation, this kind of measure should have created mobilization, reaction, awareness of the people, and reaction from the people and the opposition parties and all that. And as we are so concentrated on COVID and so worried about the situation, the death rates, the data, which many governments are giving us in a manipulated way, which is another thing. But they have used this situation in many countries to go to more substantial things. You mentioned the green agenda, but I can say the same in some countries, related institutional changes that affect rights, affect the accountability controls in society, and they are changing the judiciary or the accountant office or the public procurement system or the prosecutor's office, because people is looking at other things. And we have, as this is a responsibility for us, we have to be alert, not only about the curve that is in front of us, but looking aside, because they are creating subways and sub-crossroads that are very dangerous, and we have to take into account that. And for instance, in terms of data that you mentioned, it's not only the importance of tech, and as a tool, tech can be used for good and for bad. But nowadays, this week in UK, we are facing a problem with the A-level test for students to go to college. And as they were not possible to take the test presentially, the government decided to go with an algorithm. And the algorithm is based on past records of the students and the school record. So any effort that has been done by the student during the year and that was valued by the teachers were downgraded by the algorithm because of statistical reasons. And that means the future of girls and young boys that probably will miss the opportunity, for instance, to go to the university. And it is a tech thing. So we have to be very careful about how these artificial intelligence tools are started to being used as decision-making things or tools without accountability, without disclosure, without any possibility from citizens to control what's happening and what decisions are being taken.
Yeah, and with the example you give about schools and algorithms, I mean, I think anytime you're basing future assumptions on the past, you're going to be entrenching discrimination into the results. And I mean, I don't know if that kind of program is being done in North America, but you know, here there's all kinds of problems with, depending on the neighborhood you're born in or your race or whatever, you will have very different academic trajectories because of income and so it's very disturbing.
It's a bias tool that can, as you say, entrench inequality or discrimination or even affect directly the future. Suppose a student that really had a bad past of low notes, let's say, or low results, but he has or she has decided to go to the university and to get the best tests in life. And they have worked the whole year. The teachers have seen that, but that will not be considered. And they have already been given the results. So what kind of risk are we facing? And it's not only education, you know very well, it's people that is on parole, accessing jobs, and lots of things. I think really far away, I think, in this road that we are going to take, technology and artificial intelligence is a red flag that we have to take care, because it affects human rights and it affects transparency and integrity. Very clear.
Yeah, and you know, another piece of the tech aspect of all of this that I've been thinking about is that idea of the digital divide that, you know, we've been talking about for a long time. But as so much of society has shifted even more to doing everything online, you know, events like this and government services and schooling and, you know, what is that meaning for inequality and access and opportunity for the many, many people who still don't have equal access to the internet? And I think, you know, we've looked at, I think the shift to new ways of doing things online has really been talked about as a positive in a lot of contexts with COVID, and in some ways it is, but it's a question of who is going to be left behind with this new normal. Yeah.
And the ones who are at the wheel on this vehicle we are all on, should take into account that the emergency is not a blank check. So they are at the wheel, but they have to fulfill certain rules. Even in terms of emergency does not mean, okay, you have to react with urgency, but that rapid response does not mean illegal responses or arbitrary responses. You have to react properly and rapidly, but in the legal way, in a proportional way, not including discriminatory measures or things like that. They have to. We have to make them sure or make them aware that we are looking at them and they cannot do whatever they want with the wheel.
Yeah, and I mean, I think certainly sitting with an international organization, there's important roles for ours to play Although just looking around my city, you know, I've seen so much of the really important leadership is coming from neighborhoods, right? Is coming from the grassroots. And that's, it's vital that we find effective ways to pair the global standards that we're talking about, the global principles that we're talking about, with real empowerment for these local actions, because they know, I mean, the situations are so different everywhere, and it's ultimately up to local people to be telling us how to apply them. But what Amnesty has done in its approach to some of these issues is we've, along with I think about 70 other organizations, developed 8 guidelines or 8 principles for how governments should be acting in this time. And those 8 were, some of them overlap with what you've said, Delia. The first one was that people first, so people have to come first in the response to the crisis. Protect human rights. Universal, so all people have to be able to access supports during this crisis and beyond. Proportionate, so what you've just said, all measures have to be proportionate. Accountability, so obviously a key one for Transparency's mission. Global, so, you know, even though a lot of our efforts are focused on the local right now, global solidarity, both between people and between governments, is so important. Future focused, so about making those fundamental transformations and not going back to the old normals. And then finally, doing no harm, which of course we're seeing a lot of harm being done. So I think with those 8 principles, it provides a good roadmap.
And one thing is very important is to inform the population about the measures, and to properly inform, because in many countries what we have been seeing is misinformation or even fake news on the voice of very high officials, which really contribute nothing to the health. We are not talking of abstract things here. We are talking about taking care of your health. Please do this or do that, or don't do this. The do's and the don'ts shall be very clear to the population. And if you see a model, a high official, public official saying or suggesting ways of action that are really harming people and will produce very hard consequences, this is really something very serious. And this, I used to say that one of the victims of corruption of COVID pandemic has been access to information in many countries, even in terms of who is at the wheel. You know, in Spain, during the whole COVID situation, as in many other countries, the government has been saying there is a committee of epidemiologists or specialists giving us advice on what to do and what not to do, and our decisions are based on the committee. And civil society organizations, Access Now, Transparency, keep on asking in Spain, who are the members of these committees? Who are the names of this committee, of the persons in the committee? And 2 weeks ago, the government refused to give answer to a petition of right access to information, first saying that there was a privacy issue for the ones pertaining to the committee, which in fact was at the wheel conducting the situation. But after that, the Minister of Health said publicly that there has been no committee at all during the whole pandemic, in order not to give the information, or really it was a fake committee, we don't know. But this was the things that some governments are doing vis-a-vis the population. So really access to information should be a primarily important objective during emergencies, and many governments has not fulfilled that duty towards the population.
Yeah, and actually what Amnesty has documented is that, but also the flip side, where people, particularly in civil society or in medicine, who are trying to get information out there, are being targeted with fake news laws or other COVID-related emergency laws to penalize them and intimidate them in some cases, we documented one case in Poland where two people who put up posters challenging some of the government's information on COVID have now been charged, and the charges could lead to up to 10 years in prison. Of course, there's the case we all know with the Chinese doctor during the very beginning of all of this, who was threatened by the Chinese government so it's certainly what you're talking about. And then even more sinisterly, the oppression of people trying to get the information out there.
And you were talking about the narratives at the very beginning. There is an important point here, because what we see is that governments react vis-a-vis any kind of criticism on the measures that they are taking, saying, oh, okay, you are against because you want people to die and you want lots of deaths. We are for life, you are for deaf people. And this narrative is very, very dangerous, because really they are trying to obscure any freedom of expression. It's a narrative that generates a kind of censorship on messages, and even self-censorship in some cases. That's why it's important what you do, or what Transparency, Cívicos, and Human Rights Watch are doing, and also the consortiums of investigative journalists that are being very active, investigating corruption and investigating the labs preparing the supposed vaccines and things like that. Vaccines will be the following issue in terms of access to information, and we have already seen that at least two important countries in the world are saying we have the vaccine ready. No information about the studies, the results of the study, the risk, anything. And they are trying even to use what I call now strategic corruption. So corruption in the foreign affairs scenario. And they will be using these vaccines in order to connect in a way, or to get the favor of some countries. I am sure they will do that. We will give you the vaccine and then we will get some influence on your policy, even in the international sphere, without information, which is what we were talking about.
I have to make a little interruption. This is great, inspire, direct conversation, and that's the spirit of our initiatives, dialogues. And but we have already a question from our audience, and this brings to a reflection of this question that came to us, that this is a very unique encounter, because you are both two global leaders of leading organizations of two agendas that have so many interlinks, right? The anti-corruption agenda from one side, and the other, the human rights agendas. Our question was, read it to you, is a lot of people see the fight against corruption and promotion of human rights, that the promotion of human rights and anti-corruption live in separate places. Many leaders win people's hearts with punitive speeches and against rights. How can it be changed? And I'd like to add one episode in history that illustrates how many interlinks of our two agendas. Not many people know or remember the first Nazi politician elected in Germany in the 1920s was elected on an anti-corruption platform. He was sparked his campaign after a very big corruption scandal in Berlin, in the mayor house of Berlin, involving Jewish business people. So they connected the anti-Semitic agenda and the anti-corruption agenda and got elected in a populist and authoritarian project. And we are seeing this now in so many countries of the world, including mine, Brazil. We have seen President Bolsonaro being elected in a very strong anti-corruption speech, And now what we see is setbacks after setbacks in the destruction of our institutional capacity to fight corruption. And together with that, the human rights and the rule of law losing ground and being attacked more and more. I'd like to have you now talking between the two of you and reflecting what are the interlinks and how can it be changed, this hijacking of the anti-corruption agenda to make so many authoritarian leaders to come to power.
If I may, I would say that one thing that populists has been very successful in doing is to cope our agenda of anti-corruption, using it as a narrative, but not properly as an agenda, because they go into power using the narrative and the discourse of anti-corruption, and then when they are at the wheel, the agenda disappears, and it's not an agenda, but just a speech, just wording used to cultivate citizens, offering something that they are not really interested in doing. But coming back to the both agendas, the anti-corruption agenda and the defense of human rights, as I said at the very beginning, I think they are very, very much connected, because when we fight against corruption, we are not doing that because of an abstract concept philosophy. We are doing that because corruption affects the ordinary life of people all over the world. According to our Corruption Perception Index, more than 5 billion people in the world live in context of corruption. And this affects the future, the life, the health, the education, the capacity to work and to progress. So the agenda is connected with the agenda of human rights. And I'm very happy to say, and again, reinforce the idea that we are in fact working now together. We are not just talking about the same things, but we are working and producing action together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree with Delia. I mean, corruption and human rights work are they are the same work in many ways, and certainly Amnesty's scope of work is broader, but it's all anti-corruption work and human rights work. It's all essentially about how people live lives of fairness and dignity and justice and opportunity and security. And I mean, you can't have a society with respect for human rights if you have corrupt governments. Mm-hmm. And similarly, a human rights framework, if a government is really committed to that and following that, that provides excellent security against corruption. Mm-hmm. So they're really interlinked. The question of leaders winning people's hearts with punitive speeches and against rights that I see in the question here. I mean, that phenomenon of what we've sometimes called demonization is really what we've identified as one of the major struggles in recent years and certainly going forward for the human rights movement. And I don't think there are easy answers for how to address that, because it's been present in one way or another throughout rights struggles throughout history. And Bruno gave one example. We could certainly give others. I think, you know, in the racial justice movement, one of the major obstacles is divisions that some political parties create around income and class, and creating divisions between people. So I mean, one way that Amnesty really tries to address that challenge is through human rights education, because we do have I mean, you've seen it historically with human rights being framed as a Western concept, an imperial concept, you know, and there are, I think, valid discussions we could have about those histories, but you've also seen human rights within national contexts being framed as elite concepts or liberal concepts or very politically partial concepts. And human rights education is a key part of challenging those narratives, and also making sure that human rights doesn't get trapped in a highly formal academic or legal sphere, but is seen as something that things that belong to the people. So that's really a key part of fighting it, I think, and continuing to, I guess, make convincing narratives that people are stronger together than divided. Yeah.
Education is key, as you say, and education is a long-term objective. That's why many politicians don't find it profitable to invest in education, because they are thinking of elections in 2 or 4 years, not in a generation space. But apart from working in education and generating critical capacity on part of the citizens in order to discover these fake narratives, I think that we have to be very careful with the use of social media nowadays, because social media is being weaponized by some of these kind of populistic regimes in order to reinforce these cleavages in societies, this division in society that are particularly very useful for populist discourse and populist activism. So you are with me or you are the enemy of the nation. And social media, when manipulated, can create or reinforce this kind of bubble communication that makes even worse these divisions in society and create an angry speech. In many countries, what we are seeing is, well, we have seen in the United States the discussion of the politicization of the discussion of using masks. So it is incredible. The people are fighting on the use of masks, but not because they are useful to stop or prevent the illness, but because they are a signal of your political position. Mm-hmm. And this is being manipulated. This is not something that people invent. Mm-hmm. This has to do with how the governments communicate with people and how they manipulate in a way the information of the data that is available to the citizen.
I come to interrupt again very quickly, but we are receiving some very interesting questions. Unfortunately, we are approaching the end of our dialogue. We are now 10 minutes to the end, but I would still like to bring these interesting questions to the discussion. And the first one is, people's material emergencies are so big now that there is a difficulty of generating awareness about the importance of transparency. Vital and material needs are the main concern to people, of course. How can organizations strengthen that awareness at a time when people are dealing with unemployment, with poverty, and even hunger?
I think it's very clear we have to connect corruption and its effects with ordinary life of people. Because, of course, people need ventilators, beds in hospitals, tests, masks, and medicines in general. And, of course, they will need some things when we restart the economy in normal way of functioning. But these things that they need and the services that they need now and are not available or are not available on an equal basis, this inequality, this lack of services, this lack of supplies has to do with corruption. If the purchase of masks or ventilators are done with an overprice and lots of resources are spent in something that is not the proper quantity, the proper quality, or really delivered to those in need because of corruption, the victims are the ordinary citizens in each country. So we have to make this connection of the effects of corruption vis-a-vis the lack of services, vis-a-vis the lack of opportunities, vis-a-vis discrimination in access to services or subsidies or whatever it is, in order to generate awareness of the population. It is not that because we are in a healthcare emergency, corruption is not important. In part, we are having this emergency and the healthcare systems are not properly working because there has been lots of corruption in the sector before and the resources were not applied there. So now we are in an emergency and they cannot properly react to the emergency.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, Sarah, the question is the same for human rights as well. No, the awareness about the issue of human rights probably suffering as well. No, in this context of disputing other concerns. No?
Yeah, I mean, as Delia used the word connection, and I think it's the right one. I mean, our organizations have to be drawing those connections. And just to give one example, I mean, Amnesty in some Southern African countries has documented food aid during the COVID pandemic being distributed along political party lines. So people who are perceived in neighborhoods that are affiliated with particular parties receiving food aid while others don't. Or in one case, I believe it was in Zimbabwe, we've documented cases of party officials actually just keeping the food aid for themselves, their friends and families, rather than distributing it. So in that case, you just you can't understand the hunger problem without looking at corruption and at human rights. And then I think more broadly, even beyond corruption, even where, because there's unemployment, poverty, and hunger, even in countries without major corruption issues, but we still have to tie those to broader economic and political and social systems that are not upholding human rights to the extent that they should. And we really have to challenge the idea that poverty and hunger are natural, because they're not. They're in large case they're designed, and it's by design that people don't have what they need right now. So we need to really, you know, if we're talking about narrative, shape that narrative that we will never solve these problems without looking at them through these lenses. And so it's not just, you know, it's not just a good idea to be talking about them. It's actually critical.
Mm-hmm.
Great. There is another question that I think it's very special because it also brings a reflection of hope. The question is, it's a comment and a question. The comment: governments have used pandemic to increase authoritarianism. This fact, although, has not stopped people from going to the streets. He or she is giving the example: Black Lives Matter, Belarus now, and other movements of people right now going to the street. Can the world face a wave of confrontations in the street? There is a good side on it. There is a living civil society in fight for their rights, but also we see this context of extremism and so on and so forth, and the risk also to go to the path of confrontation. How do you see this line of hope and this line of risks and threats in this sense of active civil society in these times?
Would you like to go first, Sarah?
Sure. I mean, it's a complicated question. It's a good one, and there's not just one answer to it. But I think the issue of demonstrations, I mean, there are certainly legitimate restrictions that states can put on those from a human rights perspective, taking into account the right to health. But at the same time, we see that states are using the people's fear to gather, to really ram through negative changes. And I think it's ultimately essential that people are taking to the streets and calling for change. Now, I mean, as you've said, Bruno, not all of those gatherings are necessarily positive from a human rights or a corruption perspective. But I think that people taking to the streets and these demonstrations are inevitable, and ultimately for the good. I think the scale of change to our systems and societies that we need if we're to get ahead of this curve in a good way, it requires that level of rising up from people. But it's certainly, there's a real challenge for organizations like ours to help ensure that when people are taking to the streets, it's in service of the right narrative.
Mm-hmm. And also, I think that there is a challenge for us as organizations to channel this energy and legitimate reaction in many cases from people going out to the streets to say, stop corruption, stop impunity, for instance, in the case of the anti-corruption movement. But we cannot have people in the streets all the day with a banner saying stop impunity. We have the mobilizations are in a way a demonstration of the awareness of people on the problem and the demand for transparency, the demand for accountability. But that's just a spark. We have to channel the energy. We have to transform this energy in the post-indignation phase. So they are in the streets because they are really indignated with the reality. Well, but socially emotions come down and people go back to normal life, digamos, or their private lives. We have to use this energy because the energy is there. They are aware of the problem. They want to help. We have to offer the proper channels to change reality. And if you demand transparency, you have to be ready to vote for those really committed to transparency and integrity and good governance. Because sometimes we see mobilizations, but when the time of the elections come, suddenly some leaders arrive to the election and win the election without properly representing that. So demand transparency and vote for transparency, and be careful to be continuously aware and exercising social accountability. And social accountability is much more than going to the streets with a pancarta. That is important, but we need more.
Thank you, Delia, Sarah. I have a final question to both of you. It's a bit personal. There's a personal level in this question, because you are both two global leaders, activists in other areas, sectors, business sectors or academia. Global leaders, they reach this position mostly because of their skills, their careers, their knowledge, and all that. In our sector, activism and civil society, you need all that, but you need very especially what you have in your heart, because you are constantly with the challenge and the mission to inspire people to fight for rights, fight for causes. What is in your heart right now at this moment of severe crisis, but of transformation? What is impulsing in your heart to lead for change?
Right. My impression is that I have been always fighting for the same things, which is freedom, liberty, equality, democracy. So it's the same value informing different actions in different steps of my life, even in the academic field. Everything has been related to values, to freedom, to rights, to rule of law, to limits to powers, and to participation, because that's exactly what we are doing, and we are trying to invite our citizens to come with us and do the same, participate. The future is in our hands also, always, not only in this emergency situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really relate to what Delia said about that, and I similarly have always been sort of fighting for these things. I think in this moment I feel a lot of worry, but also a lot of hope. And I think fundamentally what is making my heart pulse with this work is just feeling that there is no alternative to trying. There's no alternative to doing the work and really trying to make this world better, because to give up on that and to not do it is to deny the relationships between all of us and the interconnections between all of us as people, and also to the planet. So it's to deny the truth of what and who we are, to not do this work. So that's what drives me.
Well, with this very inspiring answer of the two of you, I'd like to say thank you very much for Sarah for joining us. To say muchas gracias a Delia, and muito obrigado for our Brazilian audience. Thank you very much for all the words, the global audience with the questions as well. And I'd like to invite you both and all our audience to let's build better paths together. Let's participate and build a better future ahead of the curve. Thank you very much. Please keep following us on the next episodes of this series, and of course in this fight that is of all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruno, for the invitation. Thank you, Sarah, for joining us, and keep on working together.
Indeed. Thank you so much for having me, and to Transparency International for all your good work.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.